Not boots on marble, those you might expect in a palace. These are softer, deliberate, the sound of someone who knows exactly where they're going and what they'll find when they arrive. You're standing in a corridor lined with frescoes of gods, but the faces have all been changed. Every Zeus, every Apollo, every Mars, they all wear the same features now. His features. And then you see them, a father and daughter, walking toward a room they both know they'll enter, but only one will leave unchanged. The father's hand trembles as he reaches for the door. The girl, no more than 14, stares straight ahead, her lips moving in silent prayer to gods whose faces have been stolen. This is Rome, 39 CE, and you've just witnessed the daily routine of the greatest empire on earth. Before we step through that door, I need to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It absolutely fascinates me that a story this dark, from nearly 2,000 years ago, still finds us no matter where we are. The young man who orchestrated what you just witnessed wasn't born a monster. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, history would remember him as Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname from his childhood among the legions, ascended to Rome's throne in March of 37 CE amid celebrations that lasted 3 months. Citizens sacrificed 160,000 animals in Thanksgiving. Poets compared his arrival to the return of Apollo. Senators who had cowered under the paranoid Emperor Tiberius finally exhaled. Here was the son of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general, a young man educated in philosophy, well-spoken, generous, and breathtakingly charismatic. For 7 months, he governed like the answer to every Roman prayer. He lowered taxes, freed political prisoners, restored democratic procedures to the Senate, and hosted games so spectacular that elderly citizens claimed they'd witnessed nothing like it in their entire lives. Then, in October, something happened that still baffles historians. A fever struck him down with such violence that court physicians documented temperatures they believed incompatible with human survival. For days he convulsed, screaming that he was speaking directly with Jupiter. The entire city held its breath. Some citizens vowed their own lives in exchange for his recovery. When he finally opened his eyes, the man who looked back at Rome was fundamentally different. What changed in those fever dreams, we'll never fully know. But what followed was documented with such bureaucratic precision that the horror becomes undeniable. It began with a declaration that sounded almost reasonable. The emperor, as a living god, required a temple. But Caligula didn't build a new structure. He converted his own palace, room by room, into what he called a sacred complex of divine service. The chamber of Jupiter, the hall of Venus, the room of Priapus. Each had a function, each followed a protocol, and each required participants, specifically the wives and daughters of Rome's senatorial class. What makes Caligula's atrocities different from mere tyrannical cruelty is this. He didn't just commit horrors. He bureaucratized them. He created a system. In a sealed archive beneath the Palatine Hill, discovered centuries later in fragments, clerks maintained registers that read like administrative documents from any other branch of Roman government. Each entry followed a template. Name of the woman, age, family, physical description, date of service, duration, acts performed, degree of cooperation, resulting pregnancies, fees paid, yes, fees. Husbands and fathers were charged for the privilege of their family members' participation in what Caligula termed rituals of state. 16,000 sesterces for a night's encounter with a senator's wife. 40,000 if he wanted the daughter present as well. These weren't random numbers extorted in moments of rage. They were standardized rates logged in the imperial treasury as voluntary contributions to the divine household. The system required infrastructure. There were schedulers who coordinated timing to avoid conflicts, physicians who examined women beforehand and documented injuries afterward, midwives who attended the births of children conceived during these rituals, Children who were immediately separated from their mothers and raised as imperial wards, their paternity never officially acknowledged but understood by everyone. Guards escorted women to their appointments. Tailors provided the required clothing, sheer Syrian silk so fine it revealed more than it concealed, dyed in colors associated with specific goddesses. And overseeing it all were scribes, dozens of them, recording everything with the dispassionate precision of bureaucrats tracking grain shipments. But the true genius of Caligula's cruelty, if genius is the word for something so monstrous, lay not in force but in complicity. He didn't just attack families from outside, he transformed them into instruments of their own destruction. Consider Senator Cornelius Lentulus. When first summoned to deliver his wife Livia to the palace, he stood in the Senate and refused. It was an act of extraordinary courage in an environment where courage had become lethal. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found on the Senate steps, alive but mutilated, with a message carved into his flesh that every senator could read. That afternoon, Cornelius personally escorted Livia to the palace. 6 months later, when she conceived, he was required by law to recognize the child as his legitimate heir, displacing his other children in the line of inheritance. Humiliation wasn't a side effect. It was the mechanism. The Senate, that ancient body that had once held emperors accountable, voted unanimously to pass legislation that cloaked these atrocities in religious legitimacy. One statute declared that any physical union with the emperor constituted a form of worship, making resistance not just treasonous but blasphemous. Another decreed that children born of imperial unions, regardless of the mother's marital status, outranked any children born in lawful marriages. Rome's legal system, built over centuries to protect family and property, was rewired to sanctify violation. Certain nights were ritualized as public spectacles. Full moons were considered especially sacred. Caligula converted a private amphitheater into what he called the Temple of Lunar Fertility. He curated these events with the attention of a theatrical producer. Participants were selected based on criteria recorded in the archives: physical attributes, family political alignment, past behavior, potential propaganda value. Some nights featured gladiators renowned for their prowess. Other nights brought exotic participants, Nubian captives from Rome's African provinces, trained animals including bears, and once, according to a physician's private correspondence, a leopard presented as tribute from an Eastern king. Husbands sat in the gallery in their senatorial togas, required to maintain composure while their wives performed below. The emperor directed every detail with a gold baton topped with phallic symbols, pointing to indicate pairings, duration, positions. Scribes documented everything: names, acts, timing, and, notably, moments of apparent enthusiasm or resistance. These notes became political leverage. A senator whose wife had seemed cooperative during a ritual found himself supporting imperial policies he'd previously opposed. Another, whose reluctance had been noted, watched his family's grain contracts mysteriously canceled. An entire shadow economy grew around the palace's needs. Apothecaries sold compounds to ease pain or prevent pregnancy. Physicians opened practices specializing in repair of damage the palace physicians documented but wouldn't treat. Tutors taught young girls how to mimic compliance convincingly enough to avoid punishment. Merchants grew wealthy selling luxuries to families suddenly desperate to display loyalty through conspicuous spending. Everyone who touched the system profited, and that profit ensured complicity. Greed became the lubricant that kept the machine running. The human cost was recorded in ways the official archives never captured. Valeria, daughter of a prominent senator, fell completely silent after 3 months in the rotation. Physicians confirmed her vocal cords functioned normally. She hadn't lost the ability to speak. She'd lost the language to describe what she'd experienced. Her silence spread through other victims like a contagion. Women stopped meeting each other's eyes because in them they saw reflections of their own futures. Some attempted suicide. Palace gardens became notorious for deadly plants going missing. But imperial physicians were skilled at revival. Women who swallowed poison were often saved, then punished with additional public humiliations designed to deter others from trying. Those who disfigured themselves, burning their faces or cutting themselves in ways they hoped would make them useless, discovered that Caligula had declared beauty irrelevant to divine service. Scarred women were used in rituals that he claimed carried even greater spiritual significance. There was no escape. Families who attempted to flee Rome were hunted by informants embedded throughout the empire. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military unit sworn to protect the emperor, didn't just guard corridors. They participated in the rituals, often rewarded with victims after imperial use. They enforced schedules. They dragged back those who ran. They became administrators of systematic abuse, their complicity secured through a combination of rewards and the knowledge that they themselves had crossed lines that made them vulnerable to prosecution if the regime ever fell. Among these Praetorians was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran soldier whom Caligula mocked relentlessly. The mockery seemed petty at first. Jokes about his voice, orders to perform demeaning tasks, public humiliation during military reviews. But humiliation piled upon humiliation transforms into something else. It wasn't compassion that turned Chaerea against the emperor. It was rage at his own debasement. For months, he and other conspirators met in secret, planning not just assassination but total annihilation of the imperial line. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula staged what he intended as his masterwork. A day-long spectacle in the converted amphitheater featuring 30 senators' wives in what he called the ultimate rite of unity. The audience was required. The participants were exhausted. Numbers were called like an auction. 20, 30, 40. Bodies moved mechanically, fatigue making resistance impossible. It was the last ritual he would ever conduct. The next afternoon, as Caligula moved through an underground passage toward the theater for an encore performance, Chaerea and his fellow conspirators ambushed him. They stabbed him 30 times. One wound was deliberate and symbolic, a strike to the genitals, a reversal of the humiliations he'd inflicted. His wife, Caesonia, was murdered within the hour. His daughter, Julia Drusilla, barely 18 months old, was smashed against a wall, her skull crushed. The conspirators intended to erase the entire bloodline, but erasure proved impossible. The new emperor, Claudius, immediately declared damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Statues were toppled, inscriptions were chiseled away, coins bearing Caligula's face were melted down. Yet the records remained, hidden in archives that would survive for centuries. The children born during the breeding program grew into adults who never knew their origins, raised as imperial wards with gaps in their family histories that everyone understood but no one explained. Women aged carrying secrets that had no language. Fathers who had once stood as witnesses to their family's destruction could never meet their daughters' eyes again. The manual for institutionalized cruelty, the protocols, the legal precedents, the administrative structures, didn't vanish with Caligula's death. Institutions have long afterlives. The knowledge of how to transform atrocity into governance survived, copied, adapted, waiting for the next ruler who might decide such power was worth wielding. In the decades after Caligula's death, Romans who had lived through his reign rarely spoke of it directly, but they wrote letters that hinted. They commissioned art that encoded. A fresco in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, shows a woman with closed eyes standing in a room of watching men. Her posture suggests neither resistance nor cooperation, just a kind of absence, a body present but a person gone. Whoever painted it understood something that no official history would record. The final detail that haunts me comes from a fragment of correspondence found in a villa outside Rome. A woman, whose name was deliberately scratched out, wrote to her sister. They kept records of everything except what it felt like. They logged hours, names, outcomes, but nowhere did they write that I stopped recognizing my own hands. That's what I want you to know. how you forget the shape of your own hands when other people decide what they're for. That's what Caligula perfected. Not just violence, but the industrialization of dehumanization, the transformation of people into data, the reduction of family, love, dignity, and choice into line items in a ledger. 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days of systematic horror, all meticulously documented by scribes who went home each night to their own families, washed their hands, and returned the next morning to record more. They remembered. They recorded. They could not look away. And neither, 2,000 years later, can we. Because the machinery he built, the knowledge that atrocity can be bureaucratized, that cruelty can be systematized, that entire societies can be made complicit through careful distribution of profit and fear. That manual was never truly destroyed. It's been rediscovered throughout history, revised and reissued by new architects of horror, and the people in that corridor, the father and daughter walking toward a room they both understood, they're walking still. In archives, in fragments of letters, in frescoes where the faces are deliberately turned away. They're walking still, and they're asking us to remember what happens when power discovers it can make everyone an accomplice.